First tonight, Israel is facing international condemnation over an airstrike in southern Gaza on Sunday that appears to have caused dozens of Palestinian deaths. Israel says the attack successfully targeted two senior Hamas officials at a military compound in Rafah. But after reviewing the incident, it has acknowledged that civilians were killed in a fire that broke out in a nearby refugee camp. Palestinian health officials say at least 45 people died, many of them children, and more than 200 were wounded. The UN Refugee Agency in Gaza has said it's disturbed and horrified by the incident, and the EU, France and Egypt have joined in the condemnation. And Qatar says the attack could hinder mediation efforts to reach a ceasefire and a hostage release deal in the Gaza Strip. Israel says it regrets any harm done to civilians. Well, for the very latest, let's cross live to Tel Aviv and speak to Arise special correspondent Carl Bostic. Good to see you, Carl. First of all, let's start with the story that just came through about an hour ago. There have been reports of an exchange of fire between Egyptian and Israeli forces, which left an Egyptian border guard dead at the Rafah crossing in southern Gaza. What can you tell us about that?
That's right, Charles, and this is exactly the problem that's confronting Israel right now. To put things in perspective, Charles, you need to consider this. Rafah is the southernmost part of the Gaza Strip, which is 25 miles long. Gaza by itself is about a quarter of the size of Abuja. Rafah is about the eighth of the size of Abuja, and that's where still nearly 1 million people are refugee types. More importantly, Charles, that's the border of Egypt. And one of the goals of the Israeli military and the government, Charles, is that one reason why they're justifying their campaign to continue their offensive, Charles, is because they want to secure the border. They want to shut down the tunnels. And that's where Egypt is not too pleased with this, because that means Israel taking control of the border. That's why you have this exchange of gunfire. But it could make relations with Egypt very, very precarious, Charles, because it was the first Arab country to sign a peace agreement with Israel, Charles. That was back in 1979. But already we're hearing reports about, so far, what Israel has discovered in its offensive into Rafah is that just in the past few weeks, they've discovered about 700 tunnel shafts, Charles, 700, with about 50 tunnels from Rafah going into Egypt. And Israel maintains that's the lifeline that Hamas relies on to move its weaponry, to move its fighters, and maybe even as an escape route. So what you had today, Charles, it may not be isolated because it's part of Israel's intention to maintain control and secure control of the border, despite Egyptian objections.
Carl, I understand the background that you're giving us, but we're very interested in knowing the circumstances under which this shooting took place, because as I'm sure you know, it's got the potential for escalation, and we just need to get more details about it.
Well, very, very simply, there might have been a lack of communication, where they were challenged by these in terms of who had control of the border. Because Egypt disputes Israel's right to control the border crossing. Now aid trucks are going back in Rafah, controlled by Egypt, and Israel is saying that it controls the crossing. So that's the problem right there. And you have a border guard, trying to enforce Egypt's right, with an Israeli IDF soldier also saying that we're in charge now. So that may have what happened. It's a very fast-moving situation, Charles, and the Israeli government so far has not even responded to this report.
Okay, well, let's turn to the airstrike in southern Gaza, in Rafah again, that appears to have caused dozens of Palestinian deaths. What more can you tell us about that Israeli attack?
Well, very simply, Charles, again, it's just, this is like the fog of war, because, you had an appearance by the Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel's Parliament Knesset, where he talks about it was a tragic mishap, it was a tragic mistake, but we will press forward where our goals. At the same time, there's been, as you know, international condemnation. Even the African Union commissioner has said that this just shows that Israel holds in contempt the ruling that was held by the International Court, the ICJ, on Friday, saying that Israel must stop its offensive. And what we know is that they were going after senior Hamas officials. The problem is this, Charles. They were perhaps in a tent camp in Rafah, where thousands of Gazans were taking refuge. It was supposed to be a safe place. It's supposed to be a safe zone. Israel maintains that they had not designated that place as a safe zone, whereas Gazans on the ground were saying they had maps that said that that was a designated safe zone. And what killed them, Charles, was that it was not the impact of the strike itself that killed the Hamas commanders. We're seeing night pictures of tents on fire. Basically, you have charred bodies, Charles, and the majority of the people killed, they were women, children, and elderly, and they were incinerated. That's what happened, Charles. And unfortunately, according to Oxfam, the International Aid Agency, they're saying that ever since that Friday ruling by ICJ, we've seen actually an uptick in Israeli attacks in Gaza, especially Rafah. And finally, Charles, I'll mention this. Yesterday afternoon, I'm here in Tel Aviv, and for the first time since November, I heard multiple explosions over Tel Aviv, and sirens blaring, suggesting that they still had a capability to fire rockets into central Israel, which is what happened yesterday. And those rockets and missiles were being launched from Rafah. That's one reason that explains why they justify going into Rafah the way they are now.
Well, that's a significant point you make there about the capability of Hamas to continue to carry out attacks. I mean, it raises questions about what the Israeli offensive has achieved so far. But there is, of course, a fallout from this latest attack, isn't there, Carl? Lots of condemnation. You touched on it briefly from the European Union, France, Egypt, Qatar, and the UN, and many more countries.
That's right, Charles. But what's missing and what's conspicuous by the deafening silence is what the U.S. has to say, Charles. The U.S. is Israel's primary backer, both militarily and diplomatic. And the National Security Council spokesperson issued a very terse statement saying that Israel has the right to go after Hamas, but we are engaging with Hamas to take every precaution to protect the lives of civilians. In fact, this time last week, Charles, in fact, Sunday of last week, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was here in Israel, in Tel Aviv, meeting with Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, giving this very, very strict warning. This is kind of like a red line for the U.S., Charles, at a time when the U.S. is also embroiled in a presidential election. I'm saying all this, Charles, because it was the African Union Commissioner saying that not only is this action showing contempt for the International Court of Justice ruling, but this is why it needs to be enforced. And what you're referring to is this. In order for all this outrage to really make a difference, because right now Israel is ignoring it, final enforceability comes from the UN Security Council. It's the UN Security Council that can enforce this, that can impose sanctions. However, the one country that can veto it or does exercise its veto continually, Charles, it's the U.S., and the U.S. refuses to not use its veto. They're still, defending, protecting Israel. That's why it's so sensitive and delicate, despite the growing outrage, ranging from even European countries, the EU, countries from across the board, even Italy, a strong support of Israel, saying that, this is unacceptable and this must stop now.
Qatar has hinted at this, but could there be ramifications for the peace talks which are scheduled for tomorrow? Or is there some uncertainty over whether any kind of resumption of the peace talks or where it's headed at the moment?
That's right, Charles. In fact, there are just so many moving parts to this, and forgive me if I can't give you clear answers about everything because it's being updated like every 15, 20 minutes. Because now Hamas is saying that because of this attack, this strike last night, they will no longer participate in talks in Qatar, Charles, especially with regard to the hostages. In fact, Charles, you had today's parliament where the Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke. That was followed by a leading opposition person saying that you haven't achieved anything because what about the hostages? You still have at least 120 hostages remaining in Gaza, and you haven't brought them back. We don't even know who's alive yet. So this really kind of makes it even more difficult to even conceive of talks continuing, especially with regard to the return of the hostages. And that's why a lot of people are angry at the Israeli government, saying that you're not prioritizing the hostages. And that's why you had in the Knesset today, Israel's parliament, the opposition leaders saying that you should no longer remain the prime minister. You should no longer even lead this country.
So, dozens killed, scores wounded, Israel continuing to defy the International Court of Justice by continuing its military operation around Rafah. We know that a lot of people were wounded, Carl. What can you tell us about the condition of the hospitals where the wounded have been taken? I understand they're short of pretty much everything. I mean, are they actually functioning?
Well, once again, Charles, you've answered your question because the short answer is barely. And I'm saying that because one of the biggest acute problems, Charles, is the lack of fuel. They don't have fuel to run the generators. They don't have fuel to light these clinics, these trauma units. One Western doctor with a Western aid agency says it's too dangerous to go to the clinic. And basically, all of the victims that are there, they're being treated for burn injuries. That's what it is, third-degree burns. So the conditions are pretty dire. Out of 35 hospitals, Charles, you maybe have one functioning hospital in Gaza, for a population of about 2.2 million people. So if anything, people are dying in the clinic. There's not enough power, there's not enough fuel, and it's even too dangerous for doctors and medical workers to even travel to these locations. So in effect, unfortunately, Charles, many are like dying on arrival.
And very briefly, Carl, because we're pretty much out of time, what's the state of play as far as the arrival of aid is concerned? About an hour ago, we heard that there were some trucks making their way into Gaza.
Well, very simply, Charles, the short answer is yes, trucks are going into Gaza, but no aid is being delivered. So they're piling up, including perishable items, in warehouses, and there's no distribution going on because it's too dangerous to move the aid into the general population. So you have a trickle of aid going in, and once it arrives, it's going nowhere from the point of the warehouse. So it's very dire still for the population of Gaza, which is now approaching a famine condition.
Carl, thanks very much indeed. Carl Bostic is our ICE special correspondent. He was talking to me there from the Israeli city of Tel Aviv.